Also, let me know if you can hear me properly.
I can hear you fine, Baba.
Okay.
Lafayette, Mandala, Baby Fahudier, it's your favorite warrior, Black Panther, in the building again with another.
Let me know if you can hear me properly.
Oh, you're.
I can hear you fine, Baba.
I think it's
Lafayette,
oh, Fahudier, it's your favorite warrior. You know, I always forget to do that. I I put it on the channel and it starts playing. But thank you everybody for tuning in. Peace, brother. Infinite Minds always supports the channel. I appreciate that. Today, you know, this is a very special topic, a topic that's near and dear to a lot of people's, you know, hearts and minds and experiences. But before we get into that, I want to introduce Oloye, Aikuola Iwindara. What's going on, my Puerto Rican brother? What's going on, bro?
I'm doing pretty good, man. Hope you're doing well. Aboru Aboye and also Guaro to you as well.
What's your shit, Baba? So for those that aren't familiar with IFA talk, that's how we greet each other. But I felt this topic to be very necessary because of its influence and because of its importance in the community. You know, Egúngún is something that a lot of people hold in reverence and respect. So to get it from an Isheshe perspective is something I feel is necessary. So this is why I invited you on the show, being that you are an initiate of the Egúngún tradition in the Isheshe manner. So I couldn't think of anybody more qualified to have on the show in this for this topic. So tell people a little bit about yourself, being that this is the first time I've had you on the show.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank you for the positive, empowering work that you're doing in the community. It's not going unnoticed, and I've been an avid follower for some time. As far as myself, I'm originally born and raised in New York City. My folks are all from Puerto Rico. I live now in South Florida, where I'm quite happy here. The weather resembles both Puerto Rico and Nigeria, so you know, I got the best of both worlds in a sense. So I really love it. Yeah, I'm an Egúngún initiate priest. I'm also an Ifa priest, Obatala priest, and initiate of Ogboni. So I'm initiated into several deities. So myself, well, that's me. I mean, I don't have much to say other than that. I'm also a title member of the Ifa community in Oshogbo, as well as Obatala community in Oyo. Yeah.
Wow. I'd heard rumors of the Ogboni affiliation with you, but I didn't know if it was true or not. So thank you for clarifying that for me. For those that do not know, Ogboni is a society within the Yoruba people that is very important as far as historically and today. So thank you for sharing that with us, being that we know the inner workings of Ogboni are very hush hush. So we appreciate you know, that information. Priest brother Sundiata, peace brother Sean, brother Ini Haret. Thank you all, everybody that's watching on YouTube, everybody that's watching on Master Warrior Clan, Black Panther, or my Facebook channel. We thank you all for joining us. So to start it off, being that you are of Puerto Rican descent, what made you tackle or what made you gravitate towards West African Orisha specifically?
I love that question. And sometimes I gotta say it, you know, so many different times so people can understand, you know, my own story. Being raised in New York City, I was about 10 years old, and I was, you know, discovering the African heritage of my Puerto Rican culture. And I happened to, where I was going to elementary school in Allenville, near Parkchester in the Bronx. And there was a botanica on the corner. For those that don't know, Botanica is a spiritual supply store. Usually, Spanish-speaking Latin American or even Haitian, for practitioners of Haitian Vodou. And I would go in there once in a while, and I'd see all the Catholic saints, but I also see candles and oils and kind of African-style sculptures and books on African-based spiritual traditions as well as spiritism. And I had one of my grandmothers practice spiritism to a certain degree. And so that's sort of the gateway for a lot of Puerto Ricans, because Puerto Rican spiritism is a bit unique. It's Caribbean style. In other words, it has that, spiritism that started in Europe and went to New York City and then traveled down to Latin America, but it has African as well as Native American influences in its practice. And at that time, I wasn't really feeling the Catholic, philosophy, because most of my family is Catholic, as most Puerto Ricans are, even till today. This concept of original sin, and then discovering, African-based religious traditions in my Caribbean culture, such as Cuban Santeria, which people prefer to call Lukumi nowadays. It was exciting because you notice that there's some folk Catholicism, but behind that, there's some African spiritual retention.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a discovery for me, and it felt, first of all, it felt more culturally appropriate. It felt more empowering. It felt more artistic and even intellectual, if you will. Most Catholics in Puerto Rico don't know the Bible. They just follow these route ceremonies, rituals. They do the gestures, and that's about it. But in reading, I was discovering how much a person can get involved and really dive in to the practice. And it also had a philosophical base in terms of teaching us how to be better human beings. So that was important to me. At that young age, I was realizing this is probably where I'm going to be going. And so that was my introduction. Years later, as I started reading books in libraries, I started realizing, okay, there's more to this. It's not just the, let's say, Cuban expression of this tradition. There's even the Brazilian or various Brazilian traditions. There's Haitian. And as I'm studying Yoruba culture, I'm realizing, one has to dig into the source to be able to get down to the nitty gritty. That's what I was looking for. If they have this practice, they have these songs, this drum, percussive literature, what have you, it has its source. Do people actually know what they're saying here in let's say, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil? Meanwhile, the language is living. And so I was interested in studying the language as well, and I did. Later on, we moved down to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I happened to find the Foreign Service Institute, the Foreign Service something, and it had a 36 cassette tapes of Yoruba language instruction, including tonal exercises, etc. So that was a gem. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, I was in I would say almost a cultural desert, at least from the perspective of myself. I was looking for people that practice West African or at least African-based religious traditions, and I couldn't find any. Couldn't find any Santeria practitioners, no Candomblé, nothing. And I was hooked. It was, and one of my students that I have in Venezuela told me that what I have is actually, my story is like a love affair with this culture and spiritual tradition. And it has its ups and downs in the sense that not the tradition itself, but dealing with humanity, dealing with people on all continents. Human beings will be human beings. But I never look back. And once I started delving deeper, it's just a cornucopia. You knock down one roof and there's several more above you. So it's constant discovery.
Yeah.
And that's another beautiful thing that really drew me to West African practice, because the culture is living, but it's so many. There's so many levels of depth and esoteric knowledge that one gains over time, that every day we learn something new. It's not fixed in a book with X number of pages.
Right.
Well, like you have 256 books if we're dealing with Ifa, but infinite number of pages. Same with Egúngún, we're dealing with 12, Odu, but infinite number of pages. So the learning is always there.
That's true. Usually people outside of the tradition ask me, well, why don't you guys have like a volume of sacred law? Why don't you guys have a Bible or something like that? And I said, you wouldn't be able to carry it around. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, it'd probably be like 10 times the size of the Bible if we tried to put all the verses into this book.
To me, it would take away from its sacredness. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
Because each student, each apprentice, each priest or priestess has their own, their own documentation for their own learning purposes. That's their own personal, But once we turn it into a Bible or Quran, it changes its dynamic, its characteristic. And this is essentially an oral tradition. So there's just something mystical, something powerful in that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And it maintains secrecy as well.
Exactly.
Brother Zane, Baba Oguniran is in the house. Peace, Baba Ode. My queen's in the house. Lili Lapoete speaks. Like and share and subscribe to her channel as well. Brother Keenan, peace. Brother Sister Lakeisha, peace. Sister Saletta, peace. Brother Charles Goodwin, peace. And Sister Jonelle, peace as well. All right, let's get into what we're here for. What is an Egúngún?
Okay, Egúngún is first of all, linguistically, we have to look at the terminology. This reminds us of the importance of language. Here in the West, many people confuse, at least diaspora traditions that developed here in the Americas, Brazil, Cuba. They tend to have a notion that the word Egún and Egúngún are totally different, have totally different definitions. Whereas Yoruba language, just as any other, has reduced forms for words and terms. So Egúngún is the full term, the full word. Egún is just abbreviated, it's shortened. Egúngún or Egún, just to make clear that it's the same thing, it's a masquerade tradition and society devoted to the worship, service, honoring the ancestors, both collective as well as individual. And we also believe that Egúngún is one of the Irumale. In other words, they were primordial beings that came from the spirit realm and established this earth before our own human existence was created or made manifest. Now, there's also at this time some sort of battle of convictions, because Egúngún doesn't fit into a square, or you can't pigeonhole in the sense that it has this exact definition. So some people say, no, Egún is not Irumale, it's Orisha. Or they'll say, no, it's none of that, it's Araorun. Araorun means citizens of the spirit realm. So within that category, we can also include Egberun, one's comrades in the spirit realm. That's a whole nother topic, but somehow they're related. Egberun are not ancestors per se, but each person does come with a society that they work with in the spirit realm that they've come from.
Right.
They're not ancestors. And Egúngún is the masquerade, let's say the deification of the ancestors, or a deity in charge of masquerade in honor of the ancestors. What Egún is not is, one masquerade does not usually represent one specific ancestor, which is another belief or even practice in some locations. When a person has an Egúngún masquerade, as well as the itinerant sacred objects of Egúngún, one is dealing with an entity of its own, a sacred object on its own that represents the collective. And so it'll have a name specific to that masquerade. It won't be John, Joseph, Mary. It won't be, something that's a personal name. It'll have a name such as Amuludun, the socialite, or the one that brings joy to the town. Ologbojo, Genju. We have many different categories of Egúngún masquerade. They may have a similar name throughout Yoruba land, but the masquerade itself is its own entity and it represents the collective. Sometimes I like to look at it as a totem, or if you think of a football team, they have a mascot. The mascot represents the team as well as all the fans. It's its own identity, but it represents the collective. So I like to look at Egúngún in that way for people to have a better understanding of what it is. And
so using your analogy, it represents the team, it represents the fans, it represents the owners, it's the collective, the society's symbol of authority, or so to speak. But it doesn't represent just the quarterback. So that's an important point, that Egúngún is not individualistic in nature. It's a family, society type thing. And from a West African perspective, I know that's different from what we see in the diaspora, but that's an important perspective to get out there. Sister Lakeisha, I read about your grandfather. Sorry for your loss, sister. We pray that he makes a journey to the spirit realm, is united with his clan and kin, or as we would say, his Egbe. So I just wanted to say that on camera. When you're working with a pro, I ask you questions, right? I asked you one question and you knocked out 3 of them. 3 or almost 4 in one one answer. So that's how you know you're dealing with a pro. He already knew where I was gonna go before I even asked the questions. Let's see, where am I on these questions now? Now that you've knocked out a few of them,
I'm in trouble now.
So let's stay on that topic for a minute. So someone departs, someone's family member, someone's father, someone's mother. Since they're not Egúngún, what would we call, what's a word for these departed loved ones that become ancestors?
Got it. Well, one term we use for ancestors in general, and some of it depends upon regional dialect. Yoruba language is a broad. First of all, Yoruba people are a broad ethnic group, and they have various subgroups with their own idiosyncrasies and characteristics culturally. So even Orisha tradition as practice is not one monolithic tradition. There's diversity, and that diversity represents the local nature of Yoruba culture and heritage. We usually can call the ancestors in general Àwọn Alálẹ̀. Àwọn is the pluralizing term. Àwọn, we want to pluralize something.
Awan makes it plural.
Àwọn makes it plural, and it goes before the word, before the object. Alálẹ̀ is the word for ancestors in general. So it makes reference to those that dwell in the earth or have ownership over the earth. We can also call them Àwọn Babanla or Àwọn Yanla. So Àwọn Babanla is like forefathers in a sense. And then if you're speaking of your own, let's say mother or father that's passed away, we will call them Oku Orun. Oku Orun. Now Oku, Oku, it can mean corpse. So we have to be mindful of one's context. So Oku Orun is like the corpse or the ghost, if you will, of the spirit realm. That's in reference to your own specific mother or father that may have passed away. Oku Orun. Those are the general terms that we use for the ancestors.
That's very interesting. Those other terms that we probably, us in the diaspora haven't heard of, but since you have that linguistic connection, you can educate us on that. And I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to clarify too is that that's why one has to find out the proper usage of these terms, because Egúngún is, of course, masquerade tradition. Egún comes in the form of masquerade. And if one is not careful, people may assume that one has, masquerade at home, which is not always the case. People don't necessarily have to have an ancestral masquerade. There's various ways to honor the ancestors within the Yoruba culture. And as a matter of fact, some areas like Ileife supposedly didn't originally have Egúngún masquerade. They may have other masquerades because masquerade traditions are common throughout many parts of the African continent in different cultures. So even Yoruba people have other masquerades that are not necessarily ancestral, if you will. So, and then another thing is that here in the West, people have this idea that Egún, because of loss of language in the diaspora, loss of Yoruba language and other African languages, they simply retained a liturgical or ritual or sacred language, whereby the meanings don't necessarily play a major role, but just the fact that you're saying something that is, connected to the source, and it's esoteric because people don't understand it, even though those that use it may understand a little bit more, at least some key phrases or words. People in the West tend to think of Egún as maybe spirit because they don't know that there's other terms for spirits and entities that are more appropriate depending on the context. So that's important to clarify, to make known for people.
And wow, you just made me think of a question. So since we have Egúngún, the masquerade, the quote unquote symbol or even deity of one's family or society, and then we have, our departed loved ones, our ancestors. Do their shrines look the same or do their shrines look different?
There's a good topic of discussion I had with another friend of mine, originally from a community of, let's say, American expression of Orisha tradition. And he has some elders, because the young man has been traveling to Yoruba land for a number of years. I've known him since before he traveled to Yoruba land. And I've noticed his perspective has shifted since he traveled to Yoruba land. And it's a beautiful thing to see that transformation. And he told me a personal anecdote that he spoke with some of his folks, contemporaries, as well as elders in the community he was raised with. And they have an object that they use, even though they claim more of a connection to West Africa, but we find that it's more the outer trappings that appear West African Yoruba, whereas the inner workings is actually Afro-Cuban. And so he suggested to some of the folks in his community that practice Egúngún in this kind of hybridized American style that, hey guys, with respect, of course, he said that throughout Yoruba land, Egúngún is diverse. But the one thing that brings it all together, one of the common threads is Isan. Isan itself is a sacred object that also has diversity in terms of the way it's prepared, various types of Isan. But Isan, even if it's just one, you can recognize it right away. And that's one of the things that brings it all together. Wherever you're at in Yoruba land, there's Isan, anywhere, from Nigeria to Benin Republic to Togo, because there's some Yoruba communities in Togo as well. And the masquerade itself is also very diverse, but it still has Isan, all of them. And they said, no, we're going to stick with what we know. So there really wasn't much that it could do there.
Right.
Yes, Egúngún has its own sacred objects. Sometimes there's more than one. But because Egúngún is one of the deeper esoteric bodies of knowledge, we find out those other elements later on down the line, over time. And the good thing about this tradition is that it's also about character development. So as a person develops as a human being, character, patience, and no one's perfect. The idea is not that one should be perfect. but there's always a goal of improvement. And so once one's mentor or others feel comfortable with you, and then the more esoteric knowledge becomes released upon your hands. So it's also something that we cherish, because Egúngún may be the most cherished cultural element within a family, their prized possession, if you will.
Mm.
And Egúngún requires a lot of investment.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. You had a question? Okay.
We have the Isan Egúngún, which you were talking about, which is, for those that don't know, an Egúngún shrine. So for an ancestral shrine, what would we see as far as an ancestral shrine? Are we talking about like a grave, or somewhere where they're buried, or what would be an ancestral shrine in a Isheshe manner?
Mm-hmm. So Egúngún shrines, ancestral shrines, can vary. Some of that is also esoteric knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But well, I'll say two. So the first place, if you live close to where your ancestors were buried, we call that Ujuori, the grave site. We also can call it Egúngún Ibule. So that's also a category of Egúngún, the actual grave site where your ancestor is buried is an ancestral shrine. But that's a specific ancestor. Still, they're going to receive all of the accoutrements, the rituals, the food offerings associated with Egúngún at that spot. Now, mind you, in Yoruba land, graves, or cemeteries rather, are European or Western introduction. Because I'm not so sure about the Muslim faith in terms of the use of cemeteries. The reason why I say that is even Yoruba people that are Muslim bury their departed right outside the home. Whereas people that practice indigenous Yoruba spirituality, Orisha, Ifa, if you will, the ancestor is buried directly inside the house under the roof. Not under the roof, but in the ground. In other words, where there's roof. It can even be in the veranda, but there must be a roof, a ceiling over the gravesite. That's Yoruba, indigenous Yoruba practice. We don't let the elements just fall upon the gravesite of the ancestor. So they can be buried inside the living room, inside their own bedroom, etc. And then after they're buried, either if the person had a great impact in the community, that room may be dedicated solely to the service of that ancestor, maybe some other deities, or maybe a Egúngún shrine, etc. But at other times, even those that were not initiated or priestly, they'll still be buried inside that home if they practice Orisha, not Christianity or Islam. Sometimes, even if they did practice Christianity or Islam, the indigenous tradition takes over. And they may be buried there, but it may be the living room. So you may have, the sofa still there, but there may be a spot that you can see on the ground, even on the wall, that marks it as a gravesite for the ancestor. And people live there, no problem. There's no, issue of like disturbances or anything that people may associate with the dead. So there's a very common association with the ancestors.
That's gonna be tough.
It's
that's gonna be boys and people gonna hear that like, I ain't sleeping in there. My mama in the other room. I can't do that. but you hear African people aren't spooked out by that. That don't bother them.
Not at all. Because what happens is the funeral rites help make a healthy separation for the folks that they leave behind, so they can mourn. But now the ancestor returns as, an ancestor. And so the connection is even more intimate. That's even why when speaking to the ancestors, Yoruba people tend to use the formal or honorific pronoun when we with elders, rather, with people that are older than us. But once they pass away, we address them as we address the deities, with the informal you, speaking directly to them, which is different from folks in Latin America. In English, not so. We don't have that characteristic of the formal, informal for the most part. But in Portuguese, Spanish, French, there is a separation between formal and informal. And in some cultures, you have to address your parents using the formal pronouns. In Yoruba culture, what happens is the deities creates a reverse. Now they become more intimate beings with you. The ancestors themselves, now you speak to them informally. So the relationship is so much more intimate.
And I think it's because African people don't really see people that have passed away as gone or dead, you know. So them being in another room doesn't bother them like it would bother a Westerner, because they just kind of see them on, quote unquote, the other side of a curtain, so to speak, you know. And although we can't go past that curtain, you know, us being a living, but that separation is just the only thing that is different. So it's not like, you know, them being gone or something like that. So I think that adds to the comfortability of having their departed in their house.
Yeah, so that's one, you know, ancestral shrine object with the gravesite with the departed is right there with you. And then another one, sometimes in another room or another corner specifically dedicated to that, we may have Isan as well. Some areas they have more simplified Isan. Sometimes they may bury things, but in a corner they may have a cloth there. Maybe they'll use blocks or cement to kind of demarcate the area of sacred space, and they'll have singular Isan. Now, Isan, for example, one of the characteristics is it must be decorated, it must be carved, usually with a spiral. Well, a spiral is pretty much, even though some are more elaborate. So you have a spiral, and it's a specific type of plant that's used for these switches because they're very straight. And if they're fresh, they bend well, they don't split. So even during festivals, the one that is not spiral, that doesn't have the spiral in the bark, is used for crowd control during festivals. And it also has a spiritual significance of driving away negativity from the town. And it's usually young men that will bear these switches and they'll beat each other. It's play. It's not that they're getting into a brawl, because they're young men, you know, they're energized, and the energy of the festival itself, and then they contribute a lot to that energy. But it also helps spiritually to drive away negativity as well as crowd control when needed. So, but once they're carved, that specific plant, it becomes a sacred object of Egúngún. Of course, with other preparation, which is, of course, esoteric knowledge that one gains once one is involved in that aspect of the culture. And so it may be placed there against the wall, and that can serve as an ancestral shrine object or shrine place. There's others, which I won't be able to get into because it's a bit deeper. But those are some of the basics that one can see. And there's usually one per family. You don't need individuals having their own, unless they move out, because Yoruba people live communally.
In the compound.
Exactly. Unless they buy their own land and build their house, then they establish their own compound. Still connected to the formal compound, but then there'll be some shrines that they'll install in their compound, their new compound.
Understood. So in regards to one's ancestors, do they reside in the earth, according to Isheshe?
Well, the earth would be considered the template for all the deities, if you will, including the ancestors. Because when we call the deities, even if you don't know their praise names, if you know one of the names of a deity or the name of an ancestor, we call them through the earth. Do a gesture and call them via the earth. So the earth is, of course, where they're buried. So the remains, the bones, etc., are in the earth. Now, that's a physical point, but you can consider the spirit realm as another dimension. We believe it's parallel to this one in a sense. And so when people pass away, they meet with their ancestors and even meet with the society that's related to the society they belong to here in the spirit, in the physical plane. So if they were Babalao, they also meet with the Babalao of the spirit realm. If they were Egúngún priest, if they were Batala priest, Oshun priest or priestesses, etc. So we believe it's an alternate dimension, but the earth is the conduit, if you will. That's the template, which we call it.
You know, you bring up an interesting question. You know, if you're an Obatala priest, you meet with, you know, that society, and then your ancestors, and then, you know, so on and so forth, depending on your speciality with the deity. But someone like yourself, who or how many would you meet with? You know, once you travel to the earth, or the alternate plane of existence, or the spirit realm, as you put it, someone that has multiple initiations, you know, how does that determine, you know, their journey?
Yeah, that's part of it. What's interesting within, if we look at funeral rites, the Egúngún priesthood has an important involvement in many areas of Yoruba land. Has an important involvement in funeral practices. Funeral rites, burial rites in Yoruba land are complex. Think of it as initiation into the spirit realm, like a sending off party, but like a real initiation. It's so deep with all the materials and the rituals that go on. And it's meant to, again, create that healthy break so that the departed can also recognize, okay, it's time. You know, the body is no longer functioning. You got to move on. And then also prevent premature death for the rest of the family that the ancestor left behind, the departed left behind. And then bringing that ancestor back and saying, okay, now you're back, but in this role, in this way. And also having the relatives acknowledge this new relationship with the ancestor. So Egúngún folks will have a role there. When someone passes, depending on the other priesthoods that they were initiated to or involved with, those priests will also contribute certain rituals to the procedure. So if a person is initiated to a Boni, for example, there may be Egúngún priests that have their role to play. They'll leave, and then the Ogboni people come in. Now, people may have multiple participation. That happens a lot too, especially in the realm of Ogboni. Ifa, Egúngún, Oro, for example, is another ancestral tradition without a masquerade. So each one will come in and play their role, do the rituals necessary. The family itself may have very specific rituals that are conducted for those that pass away within the family that are peculiar to that lineage. So others will leave, and then the descendants of that house, of that departed as well, will also play their role to get it done. So yeah, a person that belongs to different societies here will also meet up with their folks in the spirit realm.
Wow. Excellent stuff. So Egúngún, this society, the worshipers, the priests, it sounds like they're very inclusive, very secretive organization, if you will. Is Egúngún a very secretive priesthood?
Yeah, it has. I like to call it secret. Yeah, the secrets, there's esoteric knowledge that becomes revealed over time, and there's certain prohibitions or guidelines. For example, whoever dances a masquerade, at least within the realm of Egúngún, not other masquerade traditions in Yoruba land necessarily, although that may also be the case. But the identity of the person that wears the mask, that bears it and dances it, is not supposed to be revealed to others that are not members or that are not closely related somehow. Or it can be, revealed to those that have displayed confidentiality, that they can maintain privacy. They're closed-lipped. And the reason being is that when a person dances or bears a masquerade, it's not that person's identity anymore, or it's not that person's identity that's important. What we're focused on is the actual masquerade, which is an entity itself, a sacred object. And that kind of secrecy instills, it's a philosophy, a way of living, and instills ethics, a type of value where people need to maintain confidentiality. It's also about trust and not betrayal. Another aspect or value of Egúngún is to not betray, not break sacred trust, to not be traitors. One has to uplift one another, and privacy is a part of that. Yeah, so there are secrets. Yeah.
Yeah. So given it seems in depth. We got masquerades, we got, Isani wounds, we got, funeral rites, we got all this stuff. One thing I commonly see in the diaspora is people go straight to Egúngún. That's probably the first thing that they go to for initiation or any type of work. Is this Egúngún practice something for beginners, so to speak?
Well, I believe, maybe you can clarify, if you will, when you're speaking about people go straight to Egúngún, you may be speaking of some American Orisha communities. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's not necessarily the case in Yoruba land, because Egúngún can be one's own main deity, if you will. And I put it in quotes because, again, people are going to have their own disagreements in terms of their belief or their definition of Egúngún. And everybody's allowed to have their own opinion on the matter. But some people are born to be involved deeply in the Egúngún society, which is also considered a priesthood and a body of knowledge, a society, fraternity. Whereas men and women are involved, but usually it's the men that play a major role in Egúngún. So in some areas, women will play sort of a superficial role, or they may have chieftaincy title also once they, maybe when they're younger, or even when they stop having their menstrual cycle, when they pass menopause or reach menopause. So it's not necessarily the case that people automatically get involved in Egúngún, get initiated. That may be a specific American community that does that.
Okay.
But in other areas of Yoruba global community, if you will, both in West Africa as well as the diaspora, that's not usually the case. What is true, though, is that everybody came from someone, from two people. So we all have ancestors. So that is one important aspect of our spiritual journey, and even paying homage is part and parcel of what we do. Even the knowledge you have was from someone else. A Yoruba person born and bred in Yoruba land was not born with the knowledge. He or she learned it from others. I think the electricity went out.
Yeah, but I'm still here though.
Okay, good.
I got the backup generator on.
Good.
Overseas problem. All
right. There we go. You remind me of Nigeria.
Yeah. So hey, I'm prepared.
There you go. So participation in Egúngún site is not necessarily automatic. Depending on the region, it may be mostly for boys, for young men, with women playing important roles, but not necessarily deeper roles until they reach menopause. And that's usually the case in most areas. But everyone has ancestors. Everyone has ancestors. So propitiating, being involved in ancestral veneration is what we do. So even your own initiators, your mentors, once they pass, they can also be considered spiritual ancestors. We also give them homage. I remember years ago, I would always think of that because if you look at the way the Cubans practice Orisha, they have a very long litany of veneration of past priests and priestesses. So that kind of also fills in the gap of the oral literature because the language was lost. They don't have the long melodic praise poetry of each of the deities. Cuban tradition has become very, compacted as well as standardized. It makes it easier, especially the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade broke families up and removed them from their environment, their society. that helped raise people to fill roles. And so they created a system whereby it's truncated. What fills up the gap sometimes is the long litany of homage paying. They'll call it mojuba or mojubat. They turn it into a verb now. But it's iba or ijuba, paying homage. So when you pay homage, even those that have passed away, they remain with you. They have a relationship with you. You two have a relationship. We pay homage to our mentors as well. And sometimes you may even have to give offering to that spirit, that mentor that passed away. And I like looking at it almost as, in martial arts or other types of, whether it be Asian or other cultures, where the sensei or the mentor, the teacher, the master, it also plays a role in developing an individual. And so sometimes they may also be seen as a parent or an elder. So the same thing applies in our traditions as well. In fact, we don't have another term. We may have some other kind of qualifying terms, but an elder, whether, if it's a male, we call them baba. It's a female, we call them iya, means father and mother. So there's no real distinction.
As far as having an Egúngún in your family, a masquerade in your family, a deity of some sort that guards your family or a representative, does every family have an Egúngún?
No, but people can if they want to. But some lineages may have specific guidelines, taboos, also some regional variations. Egúngún as a masquerade tradition may have come into some regions over time, but it's not necessarily the case that everyone has an ancestral masquerade. They may simply have other forms of honoring the ancestors. They may even have another masquerade tradition within their family, such as Gelede or Eka or various others. And these play a different role.
Right. So if one wanted to know if they had an Egúngún, how would they go about finding that out?
First, research. In Yoruba land, people that may have been disconnected from indigenous spirituality because they converted to Islam or Christianity, there's still hope that some Yoruba people may be able to research within their family, maybe within the Uriki Urile or some elders, because Christianity and Islam in Yoruba land, in olden days, it was like a mutually respectful relationship, but it's in some types of Islam in Yoruba land, and even some types of Christianity, such as the evangelical American style that's become so popular throughout the continent of Africa. Like T.B. Joshua and all these people, we call them Sogundogoji, the ones that turn 20 into 40, the magicians, the performers. And talking about the legion of water demons and all this nonsense. So it's become more volatile. A lot of Yoruba people are ashamed of their ancestral connections to deities born of the land. So it may be more difficult. I was speaking with someone, a Yoruba young woman. I was speaking to one Yoruba young man, I think out in Chicago, and then another Yoruba young woman that lives in New York. And one of them has had a particularly hard time with investigating the practices, the spiritual or religious affiliations of the family before Christianity. And when she asked those questions, the look on the face of the grandparents, and it just changes. They become, aggressive, been really demonized. So in researching with elders, some of them would be open. Some of them would be like, well, I practice this religion, but this is part of my heritage and culture, and this is your ancestral heritage. So this is what I know. This is what I was taught. And that's okay. People have the right to choose what they want to practice without having to demonize what's essentially their own identity. Other times we use divination, divination with Ifa, which can be Ikin or Kwele. Agbiba, or divination with any dilogun, which is the 16 calories, or even other forms. And the Odu that comes up may hint at the fact that a person may have an ancestral masquerade in the family that they're not even aware of. And once they do deeper research, they may find out it's true. And then some family members may say, as a matter of fact, the remnants of that masquerade is in the attic over there in our old house, in our lineage, our compound. And maybe just one piece of cloth left. Just one, because it's been eaten by rodents and deteriorated over time. Maybe just chunks of maybe it's a wood carving. So that can be salvaged because it has ashe. Just the cloth itself. Aso Egún has ashe in it. And it can be reconstructed with that piece to bring that connection back to the ancestral masquerade that was there. If nothing's left, with research, they may find out the name of it, and they can reconstruct a new masquerade, and it'll regain its identity.
Wow.
It's dormant. So there's various ways.
That's wow, that's such a deep concept for you to regain any Rumale in your family. Something so sacred, something a deity, if you will, that has been lost, and you actually having the ability to put it back in your family. And that's what a lot of, particularly African American people are looking for. They're looking to do, and that's just so man, that's so deep right there. That's something nobody even thinks about, because when you think about deities, they're forever. They're all, but deities that lose their worshipers, in a sense, go dormant, until we have, the power to put them back in their proper place. It's a wild concept, but I thank you for sharing that. So I know everybody's probably thinking is, can you worship Egúngún if you don't necessarily have an Egúngún in your family, or something to that situation?
Yeah, well, one can worship one's ancestors at any point, but we usually need a ritual specialist if one does not have the training, because worship and service to the ancestors involves casting of kolona, casting of bitter kolona, pouring libation, offering cooked foods, as well as offering life force. So one cannot haphazardly do these things. We also believe Egúngún is strong. They're meant to be strong because Egúngún are meant to correct society, correct the family. If there's upheaval, if there is poor behavior that needs to be rectified, Egúngún is part of that. We call Egúngún Amuwa Gun'awu, the one that straightens existence or even character of a priest, of all of us that belong to Awo, which are the initiates that have body of knowledge that's esoteric. So one can also honor and give offering to the Egún, which are the ancestral masquerades, of course, the collective ancestors, through other Egúngún priests, or through if one belongs to a family that has a spot, a specific spot where the ancestors are honored, one can also partake there. Maybe the eldest or some of the older people that that oversee those rituals will be a part of it. So one can invoke one's ancestor anywhere if it's one specific ancestor, especially at the gravesite. So if it's not Egúngún objects per se, there's other ways, other objects that one can find out, and one can establish a spot at home to honor the ancestors. And one thing I want to speak on is that here in the Americas, well, let's say the United States, a number of communities, especially African American communities, have developed some sort of like an ancestral table or stool, and they may cover it maybe with white cloth or kente cloth or some African print or hand woven, and then we put photos there, maybe candles, water, alcoholic beverage, tobacco, maybe flowers, a host of various things. And that can also be practical and can also be like an American format. It's not necessarily Yoruba because the photos, if we use photos, we simply use it to remember the face of our ancestor. You know, people may have photos. It's like memorabilia. It's nostalgic. So wherever an ancestor is buried, people may in fact display the photos of that departed ancestor, maybe in their prime, or when they have all their accoutrements, chieftaincy, you know, beads, fineries, etc., to remember that ancestor. But the photo itself is just a prop, if you will. So that can be useful, more like a memorial kind of installation, but it's not the sacred spot.
It's not the shrine.
It's not the shrine per se. It's more of an installation, like a memorial. And I find it beautiful and it's useful, especially if you're doing public activities. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But let's also remember where that came from, its influences. Some of it may be African, others may be European spiritism that developed in the Caribbean, Latin America, etc. That because of, you know, we're a global community nowadays. People are mixing, people are having contact with one another, traveling, studying, reading books. So this was sort of created. I tell people it's useful for these contexts. Don't get married to it though. Because if you're going to be involved in Orisha tradition, there's other, even deeper and more sacred objects that are used that are kept privately. Wow. So, yeah, but one can always give offering to one's. If one does an ancestral installation like that, there's nothing wrong with it. But if people get too attached to it, then they won't be able to empty their cup, if you will. And the person doesn't have to throw away the baby with the bathwater. It's not about that. It's just being open to training. When we get ourselves involved in African-based spiritual traditions, it's about apprenticeship. It's about becoming a mentee under a mentor, a guide. Your job is not to be creative. Your job is to follow exactly as your mentor does, because these are traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation, centuries upon centuries. It's already well established. They knew, the ancients knew what they were doing. So I tell people, you can do this, but put it in its proper context. If you're going to really follow West African Orisha tradition, you got to be ready to empty your cup. You got to be ready to follow and do as your mentor does.
Indeed, indeed. Man, and you touched on something earlier. Having a masquerade in your family, an ancestral masquerade, and Irumale, if some people will, it's like having a deity that's your ancestor, but not like your direct ancestor, but like something that's been in your family for generations and generations and generations. This spirit, this masquerade, this deity, this symbol, this authority figure, this is just as much a part of your family as your big mama, you know, this cloth, this, you know, this Aikuola Iwindara, whatever represents this is just as much a part of your family as anything else. So, you know, it's a crazy concept, you know, Irumale as an ancestral, you know, how people say family jewels or something like that, you know, like having a deity as an ancestral figure in your family. That's powerful.
And then some families have more than one.
Wow.
Because of various initiates. Yeah. I've known family, I've been to several compounds, matter of fact, that you walk in, maybe the place where all the masquerades are. They may have other Orisha shrines, but it's maybe filled with masquerades. And that may be the identity of that lineage. And so
it kind of reminds me like, you know, like the Japanese, like you come in there in the shogun armor, you know, they say this is my grandfather's armor, you know what I mean? Like that's just as much as part of their family, you know, as anything else, you know, becomes like a family heirloom. This deity is your family heirloom, you know? Wow.
Yeah. I like that that analogy of like something that's strong, you know, warrior. Because Egúngún they have different qualities. Some are older, considered older, in character, so they dance slower, they dance to specific percussion, like said, get in. But others are more aggressive.
Yeah.
They're warrior-like. And their purpose is to stamp out negativity.
Yeah. Like ones that come out of fire and other things, like those are the warrior, like I'm here to show you, like show you my power, the power that's in your family, the power that's in this society, like it can also serve as a reminder, remind us of who we are, if you're down and don't think you can make it, that masquerade comes out with such ferocity and you're like, well, wait a minute, I come from that,
Yeah.
I come from things that can walk through fire and, all these other displays of power that they do. It can really be, uplifting.
And that's why, Abrahamic religions or Western imported religions did such a number on the continent. And I can speak specifically because, when someone told me, just using the term religion, but someone said religion is a deification of culture, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And when people removed, shrines, Egúngún masquerades, other masquerade traditions that people identify with and connect with, that everyone is a part of, it just creates a breakdown in the whole structure. And it also takes away that joy, because when people celebrate Egúngún masquerade festival, for example, or the Orisha festivals, it's a time when people are also joyous.
Yeah.
Are celebrating. And it helps ease pains. People come together and they may even talk some things out. Maybe some people that didn't talk for like 10 years, they come together and, you know what, let's settle this. And, you're my friend, you're my relative. Let's squash this, and all of that, all those buffers become destroyed. I've seen families, we see it here with Jehovah's Witnesses and families destroyed where they don't speak to each other. Whereas our tradition, Orisha tradition, does not teach us that. Our tradition is about tolerance, just because of the pantheon, the number of deities, and it also allows people to flourish and be themselves.
Right.
They don't have to be carbon copies of everyone. They can find their niche and still be involved in contributing to the community. They find where they can contribute as individuals, and they're still part of a larger society. So, it just is very, very sad. You see that it's just so unfortunate. A lot of Yoruba people, we're looking at it and like, guys, you don't see this, but they themselves sometimes don't see it. A lot of times they don't see it. They've been so indoctrinated. Indoctrinated.
Yeah. I look at it like an ecosystem, like if you remove the bees from the ecosystem, we're in trouble. Like, so a lot of people on the continent, people in the United States, people all over the diaspora, we're walking around with damaged ecosystems, internally, because of the damage and the removal of our traditions that we didn't even get a chance to grow up in, and that's one of the reasons I started this Isheshe series, to try to expose people to, traditional Yoruba spirituality so they can be informed. And I thank you for coming on. Thank you for answering all my questions. Let's go to the chat. I know we got some questions in here. Let's see here. Okay. First question is, what are the ways we can honor those in our family that have passed?
The ways we can honor so, each spiritual tradition also has its own ways of being. So people have to select the manner in which they want to honor their ancestors. If they're doing some sort of American format, something that they create on their own, that's its own thing, and it's respectable. But if they're following Orisha tradition or the Orisha or the Yoruba format, there is specific ways in which we honor the ancestors, specific foods, etc., that we use. And some people also have been taught, maybe through osmosis, reading books, having contact with others, that, well, we should give the ancestors what they enjoyed in life. in Yoruba culture, it's not necessarily the case.
Mm.
Once a person becomes an ancestor, they become part of the collective. They still maintain their identity as an individual, but they become part of the collective. And Egúngún, remember, is sort of the deification of the collective ancestors. So if you're attending to Egúngún in that format, what does Egúngún take? Eko, Olele. Some of the foods that we offer to Egún. Obi, Orobo, Atari, Oti, Oti Lile, Oti Uyimbo, or Sekete, etc. And of course, life force. All of that must be learned by doing apprenticeship or moving closer to a priest or priestess, and that will be taught over time. If someone follows another tradition, then obviously follow the format of that tradition. Yeah.
Let's go. Brother says, what is the relationship between Egúngún and Egbe? And I believe he means Egbe or Orun.
Yeah. So Egbe means society. Egberun or Egbeorun means society of the spirit realm, of heaven, if you want to use that term. And there is a relationship in a sense that Egúngún may also have masquerade, its own separate masquerade for representing the. So it's still a totem. It's still like a mascot, if you will. And Egberun are also a collective. But you're going to see that they're different because the foods that we use to offer to Egberun are different from Egúngún. The masquerade itself, its appearance will be different. Although there's diversity, but still one can tell it's a masquerade of Egbe. So the foods, again, Egúngún represents the ancestors, the collective ancestors. Egberun represents the collective, your spirit mates, not necessarily ancestors. And we all have ancestors, and guess what? We all have Egberun as well. But in the case of people that practice are closer to Egberun as their main spiritual devotion, it's because they may have been leaders of their spiritual societies in the spirit realm, if that makes sense. And that may be the cultural contribution of their lineage anyway, whereas some other families, it's Egúngún, that's the contribution to society that this family offers. So one has to look at, and all that, we find that out through researching with relatives, performing divination, especially if someone is brand new to this or doesn't have access to one's family history because either it's been lost or folks in the family don't remember, or they're not open to sharing that, or they don't want you to be associated with it because it's become demonized, then divination has a role to play there as well. Yeah.
This is an interesting question. What influence has Egúngún had on the Carnival traditions in the Caribbean?
Well, I would ask what influence has all types of masquerade traditions from West Africa, maybe Central Africa as well, had on carnival traditions in the Caribbean, other parts of Latin America, not just the Caribbean. So it's broader. One can like to think that Egúngún had an influence, but there's so many other masquerade traditions on the continent.
Right. I mean, that's what we do. We put on masquerades. I mean, from the Senegambia to Ghana, Nigeria, you'll find that element. I've even seen depictions of it in ancient Egypt. So, I mean, this is what we do. It's a long tradition. So I definitely think there's an influence, but tracing it to specifics, that's going to be difficult. But I definitely think the masquerade tradition of Africa had, influence on the Caribbean.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Please speak about protocol when an Lukumi child is marked by Ifa to mask Egúngún as an adult.
Okay. Well, so by Lukumi child, I'm assuming that the person is a child born. I'm assuming that they're referring to a real child, not an adult. And also by Lukumi, especially with the C, which I thank the person for writing it with the C to avoid ambiguity, referring to Afro-Cuban or Cuban expression of Orisha tradition. Okay, so we've established that, and then marked by Ifa. If we're to mask Egúngún as an adult, if it's a Lukumi Ifa priest, in other words, an Ifa priest that practices Cuban Ifa, they will not be mentioning that the person should masquerade Egúngún as an adult, because that tradition does not exist in the Cuban tradition. There are some remnants of Isan in Afro-Cuban tradition, but not all lineages. And for some reason, all all masquerade traditions of the Yoruba culture did not survive. None of them survived in Cuba. They did in Brazil. At least Egúngún did in Brazil, in the context of Candomblé, specific areas, but not in Cuba. So one would never hear a Cuban Babalao or Babalao that practices Cuban Ifa say that the child needs to masquerade Egúngún as an adult, unless that person is now practicing a mixture, a hybrid.
That's what I was thinking. Maybe they do a little, here and there, what I like to call Lusheshe. Little Lukumi, little Isheshe. So, maybe if they're back and forth, then I could see that. But other than that, yes, I totally agree with you. Because the first thing I was thinking about is Paulo. But
and that's a good topic, because a lot of people believe, at least in Cuban tradition, and they're going to deny it vehemently. Some, not all. Some are quite open and will acknowledge that a lot of practitioners of Cuban religion believe, because of lack of exposure, that Palo is the way to honor the ancestors. It's like the ancestral tradition, if you will, in the Cuban Orisha tradition, even though they acknowledge that it's a separate religion. But somehow this idea of separate religion doesn't always equate to fully understanding that, no, Palo is its own religion entirely.
Yeah.
Whereas it has its own way of honoring the ancestors within that context. But if you do with Orisha tradition, it has its own way of doing ancestral veneration, even initiation, priesthood, festival, etc.
Even where Paulo comes from, it isn't the end.
Part of the
yeah, either with Leba or Kimpasi in the Congo, where it comes from, that's not
exactly
the way of, so you gotta respect the lineages, This is a question that probably is on a few people's minds. Do you teach the Yoruba language?
I have, and I teach basic Yoruba language, beginners for people. That's what I do. I've been doing it for a number of years. I haven't been doing it now. We've been doing other types of training, but I have done basic Yoruba language instruction. Mm-hmm. And also, referring back to the previous question, if you will, in terms of protocol, I wanted to respond to that. The protocol, it becomes something that people have to negotiate. A person cannot practice Egúngún if they're not involved in that culture. So if a person is Lukumi, practices Cuban tradition, and they want to practice Egúngún or carry masquerade, there has to be an involvement. The person has to do, some sort of introduction or practice of West African Orisha, especially since Egúngún does not exist in the Cuban tradition. Right. And how that looks like, it depends on the individual, depends on the person, the people the person works with. And there may have to be a clear demarcation, what is and what isn't Cuban, what is and what isn't, West African. And people may say, well, it's all African because this is African. It's an African-based spiritual tradition, religion. Cuban Orisha is. It's no longer directly from West Africa. Mm. Some people say, well, but all the things that we learned, it was Africans that established it. But was it? Mm. Because people were enslaved, ripped out of the continent, brought to Cuba, Brazil, found themselves in a new environment, and I'm sure went through the process of from generation to generation to hybridizing, developing another format with all of its influences. We don't have spiritism in West African Orisha tradition. We don't have the boveda with the goblets of water, the crucifix, the flow of the water, all these things. We respect them. They pertain to a particular traditions that developed in the West based on European spiritism that came and developed its own influences, and got its own way of being. But how do you reconcile that? How do you justify it? How do you say that that's what we were taught by Africans? Africans didn't practice spiritism. There was a point in Cuban tradition where spiritism was not the norm either. It became the norm, and now if a person wants to get initiated in the Cuban Orisha tradition, minus spiritism, they're going to have a difficult time. At least before initiation, they do what they call 3 misas espirituales, which is like 3 spiritual masses. That's already become a tradition. It wasn't like that before. And so it's about negotiation, finding out what the person really wants to practice.
That's what it's about, Baba. Mm-hmm. You gotta figure out what's important to you. What lineage you would like to follow. Yep. Brother Sean says, you see Panther got one set of beads. Well, like most folks, it's a real. Yeah, I'm wearing the bead of the deity that I'm initiated to, and that's all that I wear. That's another difference you may see between Isheshe and other lineages, but I keep it simple, Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would wear one for Egúngún, but I prefer iron. So you usually see me with an iron ring or something to that nature. Does Egúngún have a sacred drum?
Good question. I like that one. We play various drums for Egúngún. One of them in some areas is Akwinti, but Egúngún may also dance to Bata. They may also dance to Dundun. So Akwinti, at least in Osogbo, is the main drum. And I was initiated to Egúngún in Osogbo, so most familiar with Egúngún in Osogbo. Akwinti is the sacred drum of Egúngún in Osogbo. However, some Egúngún specific masquerades may have their own particular taste. So there's some Egúngún that dance only to Shekere, which is the gourd rattle.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah. And then some dance only, to Bata, some Dundun. It's pretty versatile. And again, the nature of each Egúngún and each region may flavor what drum, what dance style, etc. is used. And Yoruba culture has specific dance styles, depending on deity, but also depending on region. So you're going to see like the Ijebu, Yengbe, I believe is one of their dance styles. And you can know, when you see it, you're going to say, oh, these are Arema or Ijebu people. You can notice the dance style. Other dance styles are more Oyo. You're going to notice it. And especially where people have a rich tradition of the separate dance styles of each deity, you can also notice them as well.
Interesting. Yeah. I wanted to speak to this. Abakua is a masquerade tradition in Cuba, but it does not come from Orisha.
Correct.
It comes from Ekpe society, which are also in Nigeria, but they're also in amongst the Ajagum people coming out of Cameroon. So that's not Orisha tradition, but it is from Africa. These are the Leopard Society people. And there's actually a presentation on this channel, if you're watching on the Mossi, about the Ekpe that I did years ago, and their involvement and how it made its way to Cuba and developed lodges and its association with Freemasonry and all types of other stuff. So check it out on this channel. Just type in Ekpe Mossi Warrior Clan, it should come up.
Yeah, and that's always been a thought of mine, that we know that in Abakua in Cuba, the Ireme, they call it Ireme, I-R-E-M-E. survived as a masquerade tradition, but Egúngún of the Yoruba did not. So I thought that was very interesting, maybe because they're more hermetic as well. By the way, the Ireme is what's called the Idem in Ekbe society. Idem is IDEM, and it became creolized Ireme, IREME in Cuba. And they have a very strong masquerade tradition. And it's not just one, but only one style was preserved or carried over and then developed in Cuba, whereas there's various masquerades in Ekbe of Nigeria and Cameroon. It's not just one style.
Yeah, and I got pictures of them in my presentation. There you got a lot of masquerades, man. I mean, just woo. I couldn't even find the meanings to all of them, but yeah, they got a whole lot of masquerades.
Ekbe has diversity with masquerades. Yoruba masquerade traditions, even within Egúngún, is diverse. A whole lot of diversity.
Yeah, I mean, Egúngún, you never know how Egúngún is going to come out. I mean, you just don't know what type, what he's going to have in his hand, you know, how he's going to dance, what music it likes. You know, one thing before you go, Baba, in West African Egúngún, I noticed they dance with Egúngún, they give Egúngún money, they get close. Whereas in the diaspora, it's more hands off. You know, that difference. Why do you think that difference exists?
So my references to Egúngún in the diaspora are predominantly Egúngún from the Ilha de Itaparica, which is the island of Itaparica in Brazil, right in Salvador, in Bahia, in Brazil, as well as Oyotunji Egúngún Society, Oyotunji African Village in Sheldon, Beaufort County. Some of that has its African source, it's West African or Yoruba source. It depends on the area you go to in Yoruba land. It also depends on the masquerade itself. So some masquerades are not meant to be touched by ordinary people. They're not society members, etc. Others, not so much. And this is a good topic of discussion because I remember one gentleman, he actually lives in Spain. He was initiated to Egúngún and Ibadan. And for some reason, he felt he was at odds with his mentor. His mentor did not initiate him to Egúngún. He had Egúngún priest do the initiation, but also he was involved that they were Yoruba people. And he started getting in contact with some Egúngún people in Benin Republic, Yoruba people that live on the Benin Republic side. So that's sometimes where you see this hands-off approach or more Western Yoruba areas, even within Nigeria. But it totally depends, you know. And the person had this belief that it's watered down in Ibadan. They're not doing things correctly as they used to do. But see, that is the narrative. That's the how do you say the story, the one person story. I forgot the one person narrative. I forgot what they call that terminology that's been popular now. Yoruba culture is diverse. People gotta travel. They have to be exposed to other ways of being, so that they understand there's not just one way. There's various ways. Just find one that works for you. But this idea that Ibadan is, is not doing it properly, or some other areas, only this area is doing it properly. Those kinds of conversations happen. It's about ego, and people are gonna up their own tradition. That's normal. That's human. Everywhere you go in Yoruba land, people are gonna up their tradition, believe that what they do is authentic and ancient, but they all are, so long as it's not fraud and based on training, knowledge that's been passed down. So it depends. It all depends.
Let's take this question because I knew somebody was thinking this. Can you explain the difference between spiritism and how it differs from Isha?
I like to tell people that spiritism has a set of practices or beliefs that they simply repackaged, that come from beliefs and traditions from other cultural beliefs and practices. Now, Spiritism, as we know it in the Americas, apparently started in Europe in the era of seances in the 1900s, no, 19th century, 1800s, later part of the 1800s, apparently. That puts it as the 19th century. And it was apparently carried to the Americas, and the first stop apparently was New York, New York. And then from there, it traveled down. Now, please don't write anything in stone. Don't quote me, because this is what I've been exposed to. And there's a lot of details that I'm not giving, and maybe other nuances that I'm not aware of. But it started off in Europe with the era of the seances, and then went to New York, and then traveled down to the Americas, to Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, all these different areas where there was intermingling of Europeans and Africans and native populations. And so it's a broad term, and it has its own idiosyncrasies wherever it goes. And as a matter of fact, you're going to see a variety of blended spiritist or African traditions. Like you go to Guyana, and they have, I think it's called Compa. Compa. It's an African-based spiritist religion in Guyana, and it has a feel of almost like a Baptist church, but with other entities that they serve, African, Asian, etc. So you're going to have that reoccurring theme of all these different groups of entities, and it's interesting because it reflects the nature of Latin America, which is very racially, ethnically mixed.
Yeah,
where people have brought different cultural and spiritual traditions into the mix. So the ones that they practice in Cuba are going to be a little bit different from what they practice in Puerto Rico, what they practice in Brazil. There's various spiritist traditions there. So it's basically a European / New World, if you will, America's type of tradition that represents the intermingling of different ethnic, cultural identities.
You see this on the screen. We were talking about this at one point, and I tell all my icon friends I am jealous. I am jealous of, because they don't have to go through the 100 different channels like we do.
That's the I guess that was the point. Yeah, because I read it here. It says, "Hey, this is the advantage that the account have over Europe." Yeah. At least here in the States, because when I look at the Akan tradition, it is a tradition to emulate. I love the Akan tradition. I've been to various festivities. I've had friends, acquaintances of the Akan tradition, and it reminds me of back home. When I say back home, I'm talking about Yoruba land in West Africa. So yeah, the Akan traditions that were, well, at least in the States, that they were brought over to the States, were brought directly from Ghana. But let's remember traditions like Winti. Winti is from Suriname, and that has a very strong Akan base. But it's also hybridized. It also has its own mix. So that one did not come directly. It came from, obviously, from that era, from the transatlantic slave trade era, to Suriname, but it developed its own way of being. Whereas the Akan tradition, we know that came via, Nana Denny Zulu came to New York City and then spread to other parts of the United States. That one is definitely directly from Ghana and has maintained its own identity. I see that some Akan practitioners that are also a little bit whimsical, a little bit eclectic, but those are individuals that we see them and we recognize that's their own thing, But for the most part, Akan tradition is very faithful to its origins, and I love it.
I wish we had, but it's just my wish, But thank you for coming on, Baba. I think we got to everybody's questions.
Okay.
Tell them where they can find you, Baba.
So on Facebook, Nathan Lugo. I also go by Olunwi Osa. On Instagram, Olunwi_Osa with a double O. Olunwi_Osa. I'm not mistaken. Also, my website, www.olorisha.com, and that's www.olorisha.com. Okay, those are the three main places you guys can find me.
Absolutely. And being start my Instagram page over, follow me at BlakPanthaMossi. Y'all should know how to spell my name by now, but yeah, follow me. And it's in the comments. It's in the comments of this video. I mean, not the comments, but the description of this video. So follow me on there. And also always support us at the Mossi Warrior Clan and the Kofi Piche research team. We got our publications on the website, Amazon.com. So, you know, pick up all the Spears of the Mossi volumes 1, 2, and 3. Pick up my journal, Killmonger's Corner, volume 1 and 2, world's only conscious community Pan-African journal. Pick up some gear at Family Connect Apparel. Pick up some gear at Dekinga. My brother Okomfo has his own clothing line, Dekinga store. Pick up some fly gear there. And, you know, just support us, man. Like, share, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Share the video. We always appreciate it, man. And final words, Baba, before we close out?
Well, just I pray in the name of Oludumare, all of the Irumale. When I say Irumale, I mean all the deities. So even the Akan deities, I pray that they can restore the good condition, as one brother out in California, and he's in Atlanta, also usually references, that can bring about healing, justice as well, empowerment, and that we can see our traditions flourish, whereas people can take their rightful place of joy, of political, educational empowerment. And may it be so.
Absolutely. So, thank you everybody for tuning in. We're going to get out of here. As always, I'm your favorite warrior, Blak Pantha. Odabo, which means goodbye.
Odabo.